Please get me out of here!
She was traded in a bet and locked in a cell like an animal until a mobster discovered it and changed her destiny. Each like and comment helps heart pulses touch even more hearts. The dampness of the cellars stuck to Catherine's skin like a second layer of despair. 3 days had passed since her uncle had handed her over to settle a debt. The humid and closed environment made it difficult to breathe. The cold bars prevented her from moving freely, causing discomfort whenever she tried to lean on them. The physical pain, however, hurt less than the still fresh betrayal in her chest. She closed her eyes and whispered into the emptiness, "How could you do this to me after everything?" The sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor made her raise her head for the first time in hours. These weren't the heavy, casual steps of the men who brought her dirty water twice a day. These were different, measured, confident, as if each movement was calculated with military precision. Catherine shrank further into the corner of the cell, trying to become invisible, as she had learned to do throughout her life when things got dangerous. Her heart raced when the footsteps stopped exactly in front of her prison. Please don't let them take me somewhere worse, she thought, clenching her fists until her nails dug into her palms. The figure that materialized before the bars made her forget to breathe for a moment. Giovanni Bianchi stood there, imposing even in the dimness of the cellars, wearing a dark suit that contrasted with the filth of the environment as if he belonged to a completely different world. His dark eyes scanned the space with the same coldness she imagined he would use to evaluate a business deal, but when his gaze met hers, something imperceptible changed in his expression. Catherine felt as if he was seeing through all the layers of fear and humiliation she had built around herself in the last few days. "Who did this to you?" he asked, and his voice had a harsh quality she hadn't expected. Catherine tried to speak, but her throat was too dry to form coherent words. She just stared at him, trying to decipher what she saw in those eyes that seemed to hold more secrets than she could imagine. Giovanni wasn't just handsome. He was magnetic in a way that frightened her, as if he had the power to change the course of things just by his presence. There was a natural authority in him that made the air around seem denser, more charged with possibilities. Even through the bars, she could smell the subtle scent of his cologne mixed with something that could only be described as pure power. "I don't know why I'm here," she finally managed to whisper, and hated how fragile and broken her voice sounded. Giovanni's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly when he heard her answer. His eyes traveled over her face with an intensity that made Catherine feel exposed in a way that had nothing to do with her dirty, torn clothes. It was as if he was memorizing every detail, every mark of suffering, every trace of resistance she still maintained. Giovanni turned to the man accompanying him, a short, nervous fellow who was sweating even in the cold of the cellars, and his voice cut through the air like a blade. "Who authorized this?" he asked, and even Catherine, who didn't know him, could sense the danger emanating from that seemingly calm tone. The short man began to stutter explanations about debts and payments, but Giovanni silenced him with just a look. Catherine watched fascinated how his power worked, how he didn't need to shout or threaten for his will to be respected. There was something almost hypnotic in the way he controlled the situation without apparent effort, as if the world around him simply bent to his presence. When Giovanni looked back at her, Catherine felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold of the cellars. It was fear, yes, but mixed with something she couldn't name, something that made her heart beat irregularly. "Nobody should be here," he said, and she wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to himself. Giovanni took a set of keys from his coat pocket and opened the cell with precise, controlled movements. Catherine instinctively backed away when the door opened, not because she was afraid of him specifically, but because she had learned that when doors opened in her life, it was rarely for something good. He seemed to understand her hesitation and didn't approach, just extended his hand toward her with a patience that contrasted with the urgency she felt emanating from him. His fingers were long and elegant, but she could see small marks that suggested those hands knew hard work beyond business meetings. "You don't need to be afraid of me," he said softly, and Catherine wanted to believe those words more than anything she had ever heard. She hesitated for another moment before accepting the extended hand. His touch was firm and warm, an unexpected anchor amid the chaos that her life had become. Giovanni helped her up with a care that surprised her, as if she were made of something precious that could break at any moment. Catherine felt her legs tremble after 3 days sitting on the cold floor and instinctively leaned on him for a second before pulling away, embarrassed. His scent enveloped her again, a mixture of cedar and something indefinable that made her head spin slightly. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, looking directly into his eyes for the first time. The question seemed to catch him off guard. Giovanni remained silent for a long moment, studying her face, as if searching for the answer in her delicate features marked by exhaustion. Catherine saw something pass through his eyes, a shadow of what could be vulnerability, before he recomposed the mask of absolute control. There was a tension in his shoulders that wasn't there before, as if her mere presence affected him in a way he didn't expect or approve of. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, rougher. "Because no one deserves to be treated like an animal," he said. But Catherine had the feeling that wasn't the whole truth. They walked up through the casino corridors in silence, Giovanni walking slightly ahead of her, as if creating an invisible shield against any danger that might arise. Catherine tried not to notice how other men respectfully moved away when they saw him, as if his mere presence was enough to alter the dynamics of the entire environment. The contrast between the dirty basement and the upper floors was striking. Expensive carpets, crystal chandeliers, the kind of luxury she had only seen in movies. But what impressed her most was how Giovanni moved through this world as if it were his by right, without arrogance, just with the absolute certainty of someone who belongs. "This is your world," she said, more as a statement than a question. Giovanni stopped in front of double dark wooden doors and turned to her. For a moment, Catherine thought he was going to say something important, something that would explain what had been happening between them since the moment their eyes met in the basement. But he just opened the door and gestured for her to enter. The suite that was revealed was more luxurious than anywhere Catherine had ever been in her entire life. Huge windows overlooking the city, furniture that looked like it came from a magazine, a bathroom that was bigger than the room where she lived with her uncle. It was a completely different world, a universe of possibilities she had never imagined for herself. "You can stay here for as long as you need," Giovanni said, and there was a formality in his voice that didn't match the intensity of his gaze. Catherine walked to the window and looked at the city stretching below, thousands of lights blinking like earthly stars. It was beautiful and frightening at the same time, just like everything related to the man standing behind her. She could feel his presence even without turning around, an energy that seemed to fill all the space around her. When she finally turned to thank him, Giovanni was already heading for the door, and Catherine felt an inexplicable pang of panic at the idea of being alone again. There was something about him that made her feel safe for the first time in days, and the prospect of losing that feeling scared her more than she would like to admit. "Wait," she called, and he stopped with his hand on the doorknob. Giovanni turned slowly, and Catherine saw something in his eyes that made her heart race. It was an internal struggle, as if he were debating with himself about something important. For a moment she thought he would come back, that he would explain what was happening, that he would admit there was something beyond mere compassion in his actions. But then the mask of control returned to place, and he just nodded almost formally. He took a golden key from his pocket and placed it on the center table, the metal making a soft sound as it touched the polished wood. "You're safe now," he said, but his words carried a weight that Catherine couldn't fully comprehend. When the door closed behind Giovanni, Catherine stood in the middle of the luxurious suite, trying to process everything that had happened. The golden key gleamed on the table, a symbol of freedom that somehow didn't seem complete. She could leave, she could open that door and walk away, but something inside her whispered that this freedom was just an illusion. Giovanni had taken her out of one prison, but Catherine had the disturbing feeling that she had entered another, one much more subtle and infinitely more dangerous. She grabbed the key with trembling fingers and pressed it against her chest. "What do you want from me?" she asked the emptiness. But the question that really haunted her was why a part of her didn't want to find out the answer. Night fell over the city as Catherine remained by the window, watching the lights flickering below like a reflection of the questions flickering in her mind. She had gained freedom, security, luxury, everything anyone in her position would desire. But when she closed her eyes, all she could see were those dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets she was dying to discover. Giovanni Bianchi had appeared in her life like an unexpected storm, changing everything in a matter of minutes, and Catherine knew with a certainty that frightened her that nothing would ever be the same. She looked again at the key in her hands and whispered to the knight. He left the suite key on the table, but she knew she wasn't really free to leave. A week had passed since Catherine had woken up in that luxurious suite, and she still hadn't discovered the rules of the game she was apparently inserted in. Every morning, exactly at 8 o'clock, Giovanni knocked lightly on the door and entered, without waiting for an answer, carrying a tray with steaming coffee and fresh fruits that smelled as if they had been picked at that very moment. He never came too close, always maintaining a respectful distance that left her simultaneously grateful and frustrated. There was something in the way he moved objects across the table, with excessive care, as if each gesture was calculated not to frighten her. "Did you sleep well?" he asked every morning, and Catherine never knew if the concern in his voice was real or just courtesy. Catherine had begun to await these morning moments with an anxiety that deeply bothered her. She found herself waking up a few minutes before 8, fixing her hair and checking if the nightgown he had provided was properly adjusted. It was ridiculous, she knew, but she couldn't help the way her heart raced when she heard his footsteps in the hallway. Giovanni always wore impeccable suits, even at that early hour, as if he never allowed anyone to see him less than perfect. His cologne filled the room for minutes after he left, a persistent reminder of his presence that made Catherine feel less alone. "Why do you care so much about details?" she had asked once, and he had stopped arranging the flowers in the vase to look at her with an intensity that made her blush. The meals that arrived were always too elaborate for just one person, as if he didn't quite know what she liked and had decided to offer all possible options. Catherine discovered that he had discreetly asked the kitchen staff about her food preferences, based on the few comments she had made during the silent dinners they shared. There was something touching about the way he tried to guess her tastes, as if each small discovery about her was a treasure he carefully guarded. She began to leave little clues about what she liked most, just to see if he paid attention, and was secretly satisfied when her favorite foods appeared on the next day's tray. "You don't need to do all this," she said one morning, but he just smiled almost imperceptibly and replied, "I know I don't need to." The clothes that appeared in her closet were another mystery she couldn't decipher. Each piece was exactly her size, in the style she would wear if she had money to buy anything she wanted. They weren't vulgar or provocative clothes, but elegant in a way that made her feel different when she wore them, as if she were a better version of herself. Catherine suspected that Giovanni had studied every detail of her body that first day in the basement, memorizing her measurements with the same precision with which he memorized business contracts. There was something deeply intimate about this attention to detail that made her blush whenever she thought about it. "How did you know I would like this color?" she asked once, touching the navy blue fabric of a particularly beautiful dress, and he simply replied, "It matches your eyes." The dinners on the terrace were the most torturous yet most anticipated moments of her day. Giovanni always arrived at 7 sharp, bringing with him a silent tension that filled the space between them like a third presence. They ate in silence most of the time, but it was a silence loaded with things unsaid, with glances that met and quickly diverted, with questions that neither had the courage to ask. Catherine had begun to notice the small details about him, how he always waited for her to start eating before touching his own food, how his fingers drummed almost imperceptibly on the table when he was thoughtful. "Have you always been this controlled?" she asked one night, and saw something that could be pain quickly pass through his eyes before he answered, "Control is survival in my world." Catherine was fully aware that she wasn't a prisoner, but she also wasn't free to leave. The golden key was still where Giovanni had left it, on the coffee table, but she had never used it to try to leave the suite. Not out of fear, but from a curiosity that grew each day, an almost physical need to understand what was behind his careful glances, the contained gestures, the way he always seemed to be fighting against some impulse that she couldn't identify. There were moments when she caught him looking at her with an intensity that made her stomach tighten, as if he was seeing something in her that she herself didn't know existed. "Why don't you really let me go?" she had asked directly one night, and he had remained silent for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. The answer, when it finally came, was so simple and yet so laden with meaning that Catherine felt as if the ground had moved beneath her feet. Giovanni had looked directly into her eyes and said, "Because I don't know yet if you're safe." But there was something more in those words, a layer of meaning that she couldn't fully access. Catherine knew he wasn't just talking about physical safety. There was something deeper, more personal, as if her presence had stirred something inside him that he himself couldn't understand. She had wanted to ask more, to press until he admitted what was really happening between them, but something in his expression had stopped her. "And when you know," she whispered, but he was already getting up to leave. The medications that discreetly appeared in her bathroom were another sign of the meticulous attention Giovanni dedicated to her well-being. Vitamins to strengthen her system after the days in the basement, creams for the marks left by the bars, personal care products that cost more than she earned in a month of work. Catherine knew he had consulted some doctor about her recovery, although she had never seen any health professional. There was something almost maternal in this care, if it weren't for the way her pulse quickened whenever she thought about Giovanni personally choosing each item. "You don't trust anyone else to take care of me?" she asked once, and his answer was so honest it left her breathless. "I don't trust anyone with things that matter." Catherine had begun to test the limits of her freedom in subtle ways. She would leave the suite to explore the nearby corridors, always finding at least 2 men discreetly positioned to ensure she didn't get lost or get into trouble. They weren't overt guardians, but their presence was constant and reassuring in a way she hadn't expected. When she returned, Giovanni always seemed to know exactly where she had been, not through reports but by the way his eyes quickly examined her, checking if she was well. There was a silent and efficient protection that surrounded her like an invisible cocoon, and Catherine didn't know whether to feel safe or suffocated. "You always know where I am, don't you?" she said one night, and he answered without hesitation, "Always." The complex's library had become her favorite refuge during the afternoons. Giovanni never accompanied her there, but she knew that he knew where she was. The books were in various languages, many of them first editions worth small fortunes, and Catherine wondered if he had read them or if they were just part of the sophisticated decoration of his world. One afternoon, she found a volume of Italian poetry with notes in the margins, written in an elegant handwriting that she immediately recognized as Giovanni's. The annotations revealed a sensitivity that completely contrasted with the coldness he showed to the world, and Catherine felt as if she had discovered an intimate secret. "You read poetry?" she asked that night during dinner, and saw an almost imperceptible blush rise up his neck before he answered, "Sometimes the words of others say what we cannot say alone." The tension between them had become almost palpable in the 3rd week of living together. Catherine could feel when Giovanni was about to say something important by the way his fingers slightly contracted or how he breathed more slowly. But whenever they got close to a moment of true emotional intimacy, he would retreat, putting back on the mask of polite distance that she had learned to hate. There were nights when she saw him fighting against some impulse, his eyes fixing on her lips for a second longer than would be appropriate, before abruptly getting up and leaving the terrace. "Why do you always pull away when we get close to something real?" she had asked one night, too frustrated to maintain her composure, and he had stopped at the door without turning around, because some things, once begun, cannot be undone. The loneliness that Catherine felt wasn't from being physically alone, but from being so close to someone who clearly meant more to her with each passing day, without being able to truly reach him. Giovanni had become a constant presence in her thoughts, occupying spaces in her mind that she didn't even know existed. She caught herself remembering the way he held his coffee cup, how his eyes focused when he was thoughtful, how his voice became slightly deeper when he was tired. There was something addictive about his attention, even when filtered through all that restraint, and Catherine knew she was falling in love with a man who kept most of himself locked behind walls that she didn't know how to climb. "What are you afraid will happen if you really let me in?" she whispered one night to the emptiness of the suite, knowing he wasn't there to hear. The conversations during dinners had gradually evolved from uncomfortable silences to careful exchanges of superficial information about their likes and dislikes. Giovanni revealed fragments of himself as if each word cost something precious, and Catherine kept each revelation like a treasure. She had discovered that he hated the noise of the city in the morning, that he preferred classical music when stressed, that he had an almost invisible scar on his left hand that he touched unconsciously when nervous. They were small details, but Catherine felt as if she were assembling a complex puzzle, one piece at a time. "Have you ever loved someone?" she had asked one night with her heart in her throat, and the pause that followed was so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Once," he finally said, "but it didn't work out." The forced proximity had created a strange intimacy between them, made of shared routines and silences, loaded with meaning. Catherine knew the sounds that Giovanni made when walking through the corridors, could distinguish his mood by the rhythm of his steps, knew when he was worried because he drummed his fingers almost imperceptibly. She had become an expert at reading him through the small signs he probably didn't even know he was giving, and suspected that he had done the same with her. There were moments when she felt they were communicating entirely through looks and gestures, as if they had developed a secret language that no one else could understand. "Sometimes I feel like you know me better than I know myself," she said one night, and he responded with an honesty that surprised her. "Sometimes I feel the same way." That specific night, after Giovanni got up to leave as he always did exactly at 9 o'clock, Catherine followed him to the terrace door and saw him walk to the panoramic window of the main room. He stood there for long minutes, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly curved as if carrying an invisible weight. There was something in his posture that suggested an internal struggle, a battle between what he wanted to do and what he thought he should do. Catherine watched, fascinated, as he rested his forehead against the cold glass, closing his eyes as if trying to find strength for some difficult decision. She saw him standing at the window, looking out at the city as if searching for an answer he couldn't find. Giuseppe arrived for dinner that Thursday with a warm smile that contrasted drastically with the controlled coldness that Catherine had grown accustomed to seeing on Giovanni's face. Giovanni's right-hand man was only a few years younger, but there was a lightness in his movements, an ease in conversation that made Catherine feel more relaxed than she had felt in weeks. He greeted her with a respectful kiss on the hand, a gesture that would have seemed exaggerated coming from anyone else, but that sounded natural when done by him. Giovanni observed everything from his position at the head of the table, his fork suspended in midair, and Catherine could feel the tension emanating from him like waves of heat. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you properly, Catherine," Giuseppe said, and she couldn't help but smile for the first time in days. "The pleasure is mine." During the meal, Giuseppe proved to be a skillful conversationalist, telling funny stories about his childhood with Giovanni that made Catherine laugh in a way she had forgotten was possible. Giovanni remained silent, cutting his food with surgical precision, but Catherine could see the way his fingers imperceptibly contracted whenever Giuseppe made her smile. There was something almost painful in the way Giovanni observed their interactions, as if each laugh was a personal betrayal he had no right to question. Giuseppe talked about travel, books, music, subjects that Giovanni had never touched during their carefully controlled conversations. "Giovanni never told you about that time we tried to build a treehouse, and he calculated all the engineering angles for 3 days?" Giuseppe asked, and Catherine looked at Giovanni with surprise. "Have you always been such a perfectionist?" The question finally made Giovanni participate in the conversation, but Catherine could see that each word cost a conscious effort. He spoke about the past as if he were describing someone else's life, maintaining an emotional distance that completely contrasted with the warm way Giuseppe shared the same memories. Catherine began to realize there were two versions of Giovanni, the cold, controlled man she knew, and the boy Giuseppe described, someone who had been capable of dreaming about tree houses and laughing at his own mistakes. The difference was so striking that she wondered what had happened to transform that boy into the man sitting before her. "It seems you were more spontaneous as a child," she commented softly, and saw something that could be regret pass through Giovanni's eyes. "Spontaneity is a luxury few can afford." Giuseppe invited Catherine to see the gardens after dinner, a suggestion that made Giovanni straighten almost imperceptibly in his chair. The invitation was innocent, but Catherine could feel the change in atmosphere, as if the air had become thicker and charged with electricity. Giovanni said nothing, just nodded when Giuseppe looked at him for approval, but there was something predatory in the way his eyes followed Catherine when she rose from the table. She hesitated for a moment, looking between the two men, feeling as if she were standing in the center of an emotional storm that she didn't fully understand. "The gardens are beautiful at night," Giuseppe said, offering his arm to her, and Catherine accepted, ignoring the way Giovanni clenched his fists on the table. "I'd love to see them." The complex's gardens were truly spectacular under the moonlight, with illuminated paths winding between exotic flowers and fountains that softly murmured in the night. Giuseppe was an attentive guide, pointing out different plant species and telling stories about how Giovanni had insisted on having every detail perfect in the construction of that space. Catherine listened, but part of her attention was focused on the feeling of being watched, an almost physical awareness of Giovanni's presence somewhere in the shadows. Giuseppe was charming, intelligent, the kind of man any woman would be happy to meet, but Catherine discovered that her mind kept returning to the dark eyes and charged silence of the man who had become the center of her world in recent weeks. "Do you like flowers?" Giuseppe asked, stopping in front of a bed of white roses, and she answered distractedly, "I do. They remind me that beauty exists even in the most unexpected places." The gazebo at the center of the gardens was a delicate wrought iron structure, covered by climbing vines that formed a fragrant natural ceiling. Giuseppe guided her there with a naturalness that suggested he had used that romantic setting before, and Catherine wondered how many other women he had brought there over the years. The moon filtered through the leaves created patterns of light and shadow that danced across his face, highlighting his aristocratic features and the warm smile that never seemed to leave his lips. There was something almost theatrical in the way he positioned himself before her, as if he were playing a role in a carefully rehearsed romantic play. "Catherine," he said softly, "do you have any idea how rare you are? How impossible it is not to be fascinated by you?" And she felt her heart race, but not for the reasons he expected. "Giuseppe, Before Catherine could finish her sentence, Giovanni's voice cut through the night like a cold blade. "Giuseppe." The name sounded more like an order than a greeting, and Catherine turned to see Giovanni emerging from the shadows near the gazebo, his dark suit making him seem like an extension of the night itself. There was something dangerous in the way he moved, a lethal control that made Catherine understand for the first time why people feared him. Giuseppe moved away from her immediately, but Catherine could see the frustration in his eyes, the barely disguised irritation of someone who had been interrupted at the crucial moment. "We have urgent matters to discuss," Giovanni said, his voice cold enough to make Catherine shiver, and Giuseppe reluctantly nodded. Of course. Catherine, it was a pleasure." After Giuseppe walked away, Giovanni stood at the entrance of the gazebo, observing Catherine with an intensity that made her breathing quicken. There was something different about him, a contained energy that suggested the control he so carefully maintained was hanging by a thread. The moonlight highlighted the angles of his face, making his features appear sculpted from marble, but his eyes burned with a passion he could no longer completely hide. Catherine realized she was holding her breath, waiting for something she couldn't name but knew was about to happen. "Would you have kissed him?" Giovanni finally asked, his voice low and rough, and Catherine felt as if he had touched something deep inside her. "Does it matter to you?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Catherine saw something break in Giovanni's face. For a moment, the mask of absolute control slipped, revealing a man who was fighting against internal demons that she couldn't see but could feel. There was pain there and desire, and something that might be fear, not of the outside world but of what was happening inside him whenever he looked at her. Giovanni took a step toward her, then stopped as if he were fighting against some invisible force that prevented him from getting closer. "It shouldn't matter," he finally said, but his voice betrayed the lie in his words. "But it does." The way back to the suite was made in absolute silence, but it was a different silence than Catherine had experienced with Giovanni before. This one was charged with a tension that made the air around seem electrified, as if a storm was forming just above their heads. Giovanni walked slightly behind her, but Catherine could feel his presence as a physical force, a constant awareness that made her skin tingle. Each step echoed louder than it should in the silent corridors, and Catherine wondered if others in the complex could feel the electricity emanating from them like heat waves. When they reached the door of the suite, Giovanni stopped and looked at her as if he was seeing her for the first time. Catherine. The way he said her name made something contract deep inside her chest. There was a vulnerability in his voice that contrasted with everything she had seen before, as if just pronouncing her name cost something precious. Catherine turned to face him completely and saw that he was fighting some internal decision, his hands opening and closing at his sides as if he wanted to touch her but couldn't allow himself. The corridor was empty except for the two of them, but Catherine felt as if the entire world was watching, waiting to see what the next move would be in that dangerous game they had been playing for weeks. "What do you want from me, Giovanni?" She asked softly, and saw the pain pass through his eyes. "Things I cannot have." Giovanni opened the door to the suite and followed her inside, but this time he didn't maintain the respectful distance he always had. Catherine could feel the heat emanating from him, the smell of his cologne mixed with something purely masculine that made her head spin. They walked to the terrace in silence, but when Catherine turned to say goodnight as she always did, she found Giovanni much closer than expected. There was something primitive in the way he looked at her, as if all the civilized rules he had built around himself were crumbling one by one. Catherine felt her back touch the glass wall of the terrace and realized that Giovanni had moved closer, without her noticing, moving with the silent grace of a predator. "You cannot look at another man the way you looked at Giuseppe today," he said, his voice low and husky. "Not when you look at me in a completely different way." The confession made Catherine's heart beat so hard that she was certain he could hear it. Giovanni was so close that she could see the small golden spots in his dark eyes, could count every eyelash, could feel his irregular breathing touching her face. There was a vulnerability in him she had never seen before, as if admitting that the way she looked at other men affected him had cost a part of his soul. Catherine instinctively raised a hand, wanting to touch his face, but stopped mid-movement, not knowing if she had permission to break that physical barrier they had so carefully maintained. "How do I look at you?" she whispered, and saw something ignite in his eyes. "As if I matter, as if you see me when everyone else sees only what they need to see." Giovanni raised a hand and gently touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek with a reverence that made Catherine tremble. It was the first real touch between them since that day in the basement, and the intimacy of the gesture struck her like lightning. There were years of restraint in that touch, as if he had imagined doing this thousands of times, but never allowed himself. His eyes fixed on her lips, and Catherine saw the exact moment when he lost the battle against himself, when all the rules and limitations he had imposed disappeared like fog under the sun. "Catherine," he whispered, and her name sounded like a prayer, a confession, a surrender. "I can't pretend that I don't feel anymore." The kiss, when it finally happened, was different from anything Catherine had experienced before. Giovanni kissed her as if she were air and he was drowning, with a contained intensity that spoke of weeks of repressed desire and nights of fighting against his own feelings. There was an urgency in him, but also a tenderness that surprised her, as if he were trying to put everything he couldn't say in words into that single moment of connection. Catherine felt as if she were melting, as if every fiber of her being was responding to something she didn't even know she was looking for. When they finally separated, both were breathing irregularly, and Catherine saw on his face the same shock she knew was reflected on her own. "This changes everything," she whispered, and he nodded, unable to deny. Giovanni moved away from her as if he had been burned, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration that revealed how much that moment had shaken him. Catherine could see the internal struggle happening in real time on his face, regret battling against desire, duty fighting against what his heart wanted. There was something almost tragic in the way he looked at her now, as if she were something beautiful and impossible that he shouldn't want but couldn't help desiring. The air between them was charged with everything that had happened and everything that couldn't happen, a tension that made each breath seem a conscious effort. He recoiled, as if he had burned himself. But his eyes still burned when she touched her own lips. 3 days had passed since the kiss on the terrace, and Giovanni had simply disappeared. Catherine woke up every morning at 8 o'clock, expecting the familiar knock on the door, the hot coffee and the silent presence that had become the anchor of her days, but found only the deafening emptiness of the luxurious suite. Meals arrived in the hands of discreet staff, who avoided her gaze and left quickly, as if they had received specific instructions not to interact with her. Giovanni's absence was more intense than his presence had been, filling every corner of the suite with unanswered questions and a silence that hurt physically. "Is he punishing me for what happened?" she whispered to the emptiness, but the emptiness never answered. Catherine found herself walking the same paths that Giovanni used to take through the suite, touching the surfaces he had touched, trying to capture some trace of his presence that might explain why he had disappeared so completely. She reviewed every second of that kiss, every word they had exchanged before and after, looking for some clue that explained what had gone wrong. His taste still lingered on her lips like a persistent memory, and Catherine discovered that she couldn't stop touching her own mouth, reliving the intensity of that moment that had changed everything between them. There was something cruel in the way he had simply disappeared, as if that moment of intimacy had meant nothing to him. "How can you kiss me like that and then abandon me?" she asked the reflection in the window, but her own image just stared back at her with eyes full of pain. On the third day, Giuseppe appeared for dinner alone, and Catherine felt a mixture of relief and disappointment to see that it wasn't Giovanni. Giuseppe was less cheerful than the last time. There was a tension in his shoulders that suggested he was carrying information he'd rather not have. He ate in silence for long minutes before finally looking at Catherine with an expression that was almost pity, and she instinctively knew that whatever he was going to say would change everything once again. There was a hesitation in his movements, as if he was internally debating whether or not he should share what he knew. "Catherine," he finally said, his voice laden with a gentleness that frightened her, "there are some things you need to know." The words Giuseppe said next hit Catherine like physical punches to the stomach. Giovanni was arranging her transfer to a safe house in another city, away from everything and everyone who might represent danger to her. Documents were being prepared, a new identity being created, financial resources being organized so that she could start a completely new life. Giuseppe spoke about these preparations as if they were something positive, a demonstration of Giovanni's care for her well-being, but Catherine only heard the words that meant abandonment and rejection. "He thinks it's better for you," Giuseppe said softly, but Catherine could see in his eyes that he didn't completely believe his own words. "Giovanni wants you to be happy and safe." The anger that exploded inside Catherine was so intense that she had to hold onto the table to keep from standing up and running to find Giovanni immediately. How dare he make decisions about her life without consulting her? How could he kiss her with such passion and then decide that she was a problem to be solved and pushed away? Catherine had experienced abandonment before, but never after having tasted something so intense, never after having felt that she had finally found someone who truly saw her. The betrayal hurt more than any physical pain she had ever experienced, because it came from someone she had begun to trust completely. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice trembling with contained fury, and Giuseppe hesitated before answering. "In his office, but Catherine, maybe it's better." Catherine didn't wait to hear the rest of Giuseppe's sentence. She rose from the table with a determination that surprised her and marched toward Giovanni's office, her footsteps echoing through the corridors like gunshots. The employees who crossed her path quickly moved aside, perhaps sensing the emotional storm emanating from her like heat waves. Catherine didn't knock on the office door, simply opened it with enough force to make it slam against the wall, and found Giovanni sitting behind a huge desk, looking colder and more controlled than she had ever seen him. He didn't even raise his eyes from the papers he was examining, as if her presence were just a minor inconvenience in his day. "So this is how you solve problems?" she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You push me away when things get too complicated?" Giovanni finally raised his eyes to her, and Catherine felt as if she had been struck by the coldness she saw there. This wasn't the man who had kissed her with such passion 3 nights ago. This was a stranger, wearing Giovanni's face, someone who had built walls so high around himself that she couldn't even glimpse the man she had known. There was a calculated distance in the way he looked at her, as if she were a business problem that needed to be efficiently solved and discarded. Catherine could see that he had completely recomposed himself, put all the pieces of his emotional armor back in place, and the realization hurt more than she expected. "Catherine," he said, his voice formal and cold, You shouldn't be here. This is not your place. The assertion that this was not her place hit Catherine exactly where Giovanni intended it to hit. She had begun to feel as if she belonged to that strange world, as if the luxurious suite and the shared routines were the first steps toward something real and lasting. Having that illusion so brutally destroyed made her feel as if she were falling from a great height, with the ground rapidly approaching and no way to stop the fall. Giovanni continued talking about safety and normal life as if he were reading from a script, but Catherine could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers imperceptibly contracted. "You don't belong in this world," he said. But Catherine heard the lie behind the words. "You deserve something better than this." Catherine approached the desk, planting her hands on the polished surface and leaning in to force Giovanni to really look at her. She wanted to see his eyes, wanted to find some trace of the man who had revealed himself to her on that terrace, but found only the cold mask he wore for the outside world. There was something almost desperate in the way Giovanni avoided her direct gaze, as if looking at her might break the resolution he had so carefully constructed. Catherine knew he was lying, not just to her but to himself, and the frustration of not being able to reach him made her want to scream. "You're lying," she said, her voice low but loaded with certainty, "and we both know it. What's really happening here?" The question seemed to hit Giovanni like a physical slap. For a moment the mask slipped, and Catherine saw the raw pain in his eyes, the internal struggle he was waging against his own feelings. But before she could seize that opening, before she could try to reach him through the crack in his defenses, he recomposed his expression and became once again the cold, calculating man. Giovanni rose from his chair and walked to the window, turning his back to her as if her presence were irrelevant. There was a stiffness in his shoulders, suggesting that maintaining that facade was costing far more than he would like to admit. "What's happening," he said, his voice cutting, "is that I'm protecting you in the only way I know how." Catherine felt as if she had been slapped. The word protecting sounded like a condemnation, as if she were a child incapable of making her own decisions about her life and future. There was something deeply humiliating in the way Giovanni assumed he knew what was best for her, as if the kiss they had shared hadn't given her any right to participate in decisions affecting her own destiny. The anger she had been containing finally exploded, and Catherine heard herself saying words she knew would hurt him as much as he was hurting her. "You took me out of one cage only to put me in another," she said, her voice trembling with fury and pain. "And now that you've discovered you have feelings for me, you want to throw me away like I'm a problem to be solved." Giovanni turned so quickly that Catherine instinctively backed away. There was fire in his eyes now, a passion that completely contrasted with the calculated coldness he had been displaying. For a moment she thought he might admit the truth, might lower his defenses and fight for what was between them, but then she saw the exact moment when he decided not to, when he chose duty over desire, safety over love. The pain that crossed his face was so intense that Catherine almost regretted her words but couldn't deny the truth in them. "You don't understand what you're saying," Giovanni said, his voice low and dangerous, "and I hope you never need to understand. Tomorrow morning, you leave." The final declaration sounded like a death sentence. Catherine looked at Giovanni for a long moment, memorizing every detail of his face, knowing this would probably be the last time she would see him. There was something tragic in the way they looked at each other across the office, like two castaways, watching each other drown but unable to save one another. Catherine wanted to say so many things, that she loved him, that she was willing to face any danger to stay by his side, that he was making the biggest mistake of his life, but the words got stuck in her throat. "So that's it?" she finally asked, her voice broken but still carrying dignity. "You decide for me and I simply obey?" Giovanni didn't answer, just turned back to the window once more, dismissing her with silence. Catherine stood there for a few more seconds, hoping he would change his mind, that he would turn and admit he was making a terrible mistake. But the silence stretched until it became unbearable, and she finally understood there would be no reprieve, no last-minute declaration that would change everything. Giovanni had made his choice, and that choice didn't include her. Catherine turned and left the office, closing the door softly behind her, but not before whispering, "Cowards always choose the easiest path." The next morning, Catherine found a folder on the coffee table of the suite, exactly where Giovanni had left the golden key weeks ago. The folder contained new identity documents, a substantial amount of money, and detailed instructions on how to reach the safe house that had been prepared for her. There were even photographs of the place, a small but comfortable house in a city she had never visited, complete with garden and mountain views. It was all very thought out, very careful, very typical of Giovanni to plan every detail. But what hurt the most was realizing that he hadn't shown up to say goodbye, that he had chosen the easiest path even at the end. He didn't even have the courage to say goodbye, she whispered to the emptiness of the suite. The car waiting for her at the entrance of the complex was discreet but elegant, with a silent driver who carried her small luggage without asking questions. Catherine settled in the back seat, holding the folder with her new documents against her chest, as if it were a shield against the pain that threatened to consume her. When the car began to move, she couldn't resist the impulse to look back, her eyes automatically searching for Giovanni's office window. He was there, a dark silhouette against the glass, watching her departure, with an immobility that was almost statuesque. Even at a distance, Catherine could feel the intensity of his gaze, and for one crazy moment she thought he might run after the car, that he might stop everything at the last second. The car was waiting, but when she looked back, his silhouette in the window didn't move. 2 weeks had passed since Catherine left the complex, and she had established a simple routine in the small mountain town where Giovanni had sent her. The flower shop where she worked smelled of fresh roses and promises of new beginnings, but even surrounded by all that colorful beauty, Catherine felt as if she were living in shades of gray. Each morning she opened the store at 8 o'clock, exactly the same time Giovanni used to bring her coffee, and each routine movement reminded her of what she had lost. The other people in town were kind and welcoming, but Catherine felt as if she were watching her own life from afar, going through the motions but not really living. "Is this how it's going to be forever?" she whispered to the flowers she arranged, but they only exhaled their sweet fragrance without offering answers. The nights were even worse than the days. Catherine lay in the comfortable bed of the house Giovanni had chosen for her and closed her eyes, only to be transported back to that terrace where everything had changed. She dreamed of dark eyes that watched her with an intensity that made her heart race, of hands that touched her with a reverence that no other man had shown. The dreams were so vivid that she woke up expecting to find Giovanni next to the bed, and the disappointment of finding only emptiness hit her like a cold wave every morning. There were moments when she considered going back, taking a bus and showing up at the complex door demanding explanations, but pride and the pain of rejection stopped her. "He made his choice," she said to the mirror, "and now I have to live with the consequences." Catherine had tried to convince herself that she was better off away from Giovanni, away from the complication and danger that his world represented. After all, this new life was exactly what anyone in her situation would want: security, independence, the chance to build something of her own without depending on anyone. But every time a customer entered the flower shop, and she smiled automatically, Catherine knew that the smile didn't reach her eyes the same way it did when Giovanni was around. There was a part of her that had awakened only in his presence, an intensity of feeling that she didn't even know she was capable of experiencing. "Maybe it's better this way," she said to herself while arranging a bouquet of white lilies, but the words sounded empty even to her own ears. That specific morning, Catherine arrived at the flower shop earlier than usual, unable to sleep after another vivid dream of Giovanni. She opened the doors of the store and went out to water the plants outside, enjoying the fresh mountain air that always helped her clear her thoughts. It was when she looked up that she saw him, Giovanni leaning against a black car across the street, watching her with the same silent intensity that she remembered so well. For a moment, Catherine thought she was daydreaming, that her mind had finally created a hallucination so perfect it seemed real. But when she blinked several times and he was still there, when she felt her heart race and her hands tremble around the watering can, she knew it was real. "You came," she whispered, knowing he couldn't hear her at a distance but needing to say the words. Giovanni didn't move for long minutes, just watched her water the plants with the same meticulous attention she applied to everything. Catherine could feel the weight of his gaze as a physical presence, a constant awareness that made every movement seem amplified and significant. There was something different about him. He seemed thinner, more tired, as if the last 2 weeks had exacted a price he hadn't expected to pay. But his eyes were the same, dark and intense, carrying all the feelings he could never express in words. Catherine finished watering the plants and stood at the entrance of the shop, holding the watering can as if it were an anchor, waiting to see what would be the next move in this complex game they had been playing for so long. "What are you doing here?" she finally asked, her voice carrying all the pain and confusion of the past weeks. Giovanni pushed himself away from the car with the controlled grace that Catherine remembered so well and walked slowly toward her. Each step seemed calculated, as if he was giving her time to run away if she wanted, to disappear into the shop and lock the door behind her. But Catherine stood still, fascinated despite herself by the way he moved, by the way his presence changed the entire atmosphere around them. When he stopped in front of her, Catherine could see the small lines of tiredness around his eyes, the subtle marks suggesting he had slept as little as she had over the past weeks. There was a vulnerability in his posture that contrasted with the confidence he normally displayed, as if being there cost more courage than anything he had ever done. "I came because I couldn't stay away," he said simply, and the raw honesty in his voice made Catherine feel as if the ground had moved beneath her feet. Catherine looked at Giovanni for a long moment, searching for signs of manipulation or calculation, but finding only a painful sincerity that hit her in the center of her chest. He wasn't trying to convince her of anything, wasn't making grand promises or asking forgiveness for the decisions he had made. There was an acceptance in his posture, suggesting he perfectly understood if she chose to send him away, if she decided that the pain he had caused was unforgivable. But Catherine could also see the hope contained in his eyes, a small but persistent flame that he was trying to protect against his own tendency to destroy the good things in his life. 2 weeks, she said, her voice trembling slightly. 2 weeks you let me believe I meant nothing to you. The pain that passed across Giovanni's face was so intense that Catherine almost regretted her words. She could see that each day of separation had been as much a torture for him as it had been for her, that the decision to send her away had cost a part of his soul that he might never fully recover. Giovanni lowered his eyes for a moment, as if gathering courage to say something he had rehearsed 1,000 times on the way there. When he looked at her again, there was a determination in his face that Catherine hadn't seen before, as if he had finally decided to fight for something that really mattered. "You meant everything," he said, his voice low but firm, "and that's exactly why I couldn't bear the idea of seeing you get hurt because of me." Giovanni extended his hand toward Catherine, but stopped mid-movement, as if asking permission before touching her. There was a hesitation in his movements that completely contrasted with the confidence he always demonstrated, as if the possibility of rejection was more terrifying than any physical danger he had ever faced. Catherine looked at the extended hand, at the long fingers she remembered touching her face with such tenderness on the terrace, and felt her heart race despite all the pain and anger she still carried. "Do you choose to stay or choose to come back with me?" Giovanni asked, his voice carrying a vulnerability she had never heard before, and Catherine realized this was her chance to have the control she had always wanted. The question hung in the air between them, like both an invitation and a challenge. Catherine could see that Giovanni hadn't fundamentally changed. He was still the same dangerous and powerful man who controlled an empire built in the shadows. But there was something different in the way he looked at her now, an acceptance that she had the right to choose her own destiny, even if it meant choosing a life that included risks he preferred she not face. Catherine examined her own heart, weighing the safety of the life she had built against the intensity of a love that had transformed everything in her existence. "If I come back," she said slowly, "it won't be as your protégé or as someone you decide when stays and when goes. It will be as your equal." Giovanni nodded without hesitation, as if this was exactly the answer he expected and desired at the same time. There was something liberating in the way he accepted her terms, as if being willing to share power instead of simply exercising it made him feel more like himself than he had in years. Catherine could see that he understood what she was asking, not just the right to stay, but the right to have a voice in decisions that affected them both, to be a real partner instead of just someone to be protected. "As equals," he agreed, and there was a promise in his voice that Catherine knew he would keep, This time you stay because you want to, and I stay because I need to. Catherine looked at Giovanni's extended hand for another moment, before finally placing her own in it. The touch was electric, charged with weeks of longing and repressed desire, and Catherine felt as if a part of herself that had been dormant finally awakened again. Giovanni pulled her gently close, not with the desperate urgency that had marked their last encounter, but with a quiet certainty that spoke of a love that had been tested and had survived. Catherine could smell the familiar scent of his perfume mixed with something that was purely him, and knew she was making the right choice, no matter what risks came with it. "I choose you," she whispered against his chest, even knowing it will be complicated and dangerous and completely crazy. When they arrived at the complex, Catherine noticed that Giovanni had prepared a separate apartment for her, connected to his quarters, but independent. It was a gesture that showed he understood her need for autonomy. Catherine noticed the personal touches, books she liked, flowers in colors she preferred, a view of the gardens where they had kissed. "You did this for me," she said, touched, and Giovanni replied, "I did this for us." That night, they had dinner on the terrace, but everything was different. There was no longer tension from things unsaid. Giovanni spoke about the future, including Catherine in decisions, and she realized he was genuinely interested in her opinion. Catherine felt as if she was seeing the real Giovanni, someone willing to be vulnerable because he had found someone he trusted. "This is how it should have been from the beginning," she said, and Giovanni took her hand. "Now we know it can be like this." When Giovanni kissed her again, it was with passion tempered by the experience of loss and the joy of reunion. Catherine felt the difference, no longer desperate urgency, but quiet certainty that they would have all the moments they wanted. There was no rush or fear, just a love that had survived and emerged stronger. Giovanni broke the kiss to look into her eyes, memorizing that moment of happiness. He held her hand against his chest, where his heart beat only for her. Did you like Catherine and Giovanni's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.